877-ASK-DEL. That's 877-ASK-DEL.
This is the KBLA Sports Minute with Ray Richardson.
The following is a public service announcement for USC football coach Lincoln Riley and Chip Kelly at UCLA. Deion Sanders is in your neighborhood, and there's a good chance he'll be knocking on the front door of the top high school players in California. Deion is the new coach in Colorado after a fabulous run at Jackson State. Previous coaches at Colorado tried to recruit California talent. The difference is that the fathers and the uncles of today's top high school players saw Deion light up the NFL. Deion already has a commitment from Winston Watkins, a 4-star wide receiver from Fort Myers, Florida. Watkins was considering Texas A&M, but changed his mind when Deion was confirmed at Colorado. No debates, no speculation, just the info you need. That's your KBLA Sports Minute. I'm Ray Richardson. This sports report was brought to you by MVP Accident Attorneys. When it comes to your settlement, we're a slam dunk. Call 833-MVP-WINS or check their website at themvp.com for a free case review.
When you're the victim of a car accident, hiring the right law firm can be the difference between a rewarding settlement and striking out. Call the pros at MVP Accident Attorneys at 833-MVP-WINS for your free consultation.
Call on me, your MVP.
If you're not listening to Tavis Smiley weekday mornings on KBLA Talk 1580, you're missing out. Everybody wants to talk to Tavis.
That's one reason, by the way, why I'm so thrilled to have this conversation with you today. The three people I always most hoped would interview me were Phil Donahue, Studs Terkel, and Tavis Smiley. Donahue's retired, Terkel's deceased, so this is a real thrill for me. And the reason why I have such respect for what you do is you have a historically informed conversation of depth and detail.
Be sure to tune in to Tavis Smiley weekday mornings, 9 a.m. to 12 noon on your unapologetically progressive radio station, KBLA Talk 1580. KBLA Talk 1580.
Mother, there's too many of you crying. Brother, there's far too many of you dying. You know we've got to find a way to bring some loving here today. Yeah. Father, we don't need to escalate. You see, war is not the answer, for only love can conquer hate. You know we've got to find a way to bring some love in here today. Oh.
I'm Tavis Smiley. This is KBLA Talk 1580. Glad to have you with us today. Our phone number, 1-800-920-1580, 1-800-920-1580. In this hour of Tavis Smiley, who exactly was J. Edgar Hoover? Of course, most of us know him as not only the first director of the FBI, but also as an autocrat and schemer who strong-armed the rest of the country into submission. A man who gave bonuses to black agents to help set up Black Panther Party leader Fred Hampton, who was killed in a police raid, as you well know, in Chicago while he slept. And, of course, we know Hoover for using lies and blackmail in a failed attempt to coerce Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. to abandon his civil and human rights work by committing suicide. Most of you know that I wrote a book about Dr. King's last year called Death of a King, and in that text I talk about the pressure they put on King, coming directly from the FBI to kill himself. They essentially said to him, you know we're going to get you. And we have all this stuff on you. We've been following you and listening to you, and you might as well just kill yourself. And they tried to coerce King into doing just that. Thankfully, he did not, but they got him anyway, as you well know. But it raises the question today of who Hoover really was, beyond being the one-dimensional tyrant that we are well aware of. Dr. Beverly Gage joins us now to discuss what's being called a crisply written, prodigiously researched, and frequently astonishing new biography. And as we said in the black church, I can say amen to all of that. The book is called G-Man, J. Edgar Hoover and the Making of the American Century. Dr. Gage, an honor to have you on this program. How are you today?
I'm great. Thanks so much for having me here.
It's my great delight to have you on. There's so much in this text, it's hard to know where to begin. Let me start with this. For you, as a writer, as a historian, as a researcher, why J. Edgar Hoover? Why spend so much time on this man?
That is an excellent question, and this book took me more than a decade to research and write, and it wasn't because I was so fond of J. Edgar Hoover and wanted to spend so many hours in his company, but I did think from the very beginning that he was really one of these critically important figures, one of the most powerful public servants of the 20th century, and I thought there was just a lot more to say about his legacy, his influence. As your introduction suggested, we tend to think about him as this kind of tyrant sitting in a back room, scheming secretly against many people in American life, and there's a lot of truth to that. But I think in some ways the more troubling story is that actually J. Edgar Hoover was really popular for most of his career and had really widespread support in Washington, at the country at large. And so it seemed to me there was just a lot to contend with in rethinking his life story.
There is indeed a lot to contend with, and we'll contend with it throughout the course of this hour. He was, in fact, very popular, and in retrospect, it raises all kinds of questions about why, which we'll get to again in this hour. Let me do this. I'm going to follow you throughout this entire conversation. That's how I do it. I tell my people all the time, if you think you're leading a conversation as a talk show host, you're doing it the wrong way. Listen to the guests, charitable listening, generous listening, and follow them. And I'm going to do just that for the rest of this hour. And you said something a moment ago that jumped out at me. I've often made a distinction on this program and beyond between politicians and public servants. The former category I'm not so fond of. The latter category, which is shrinking these days, public servants, I am very fond of when you can find them. Because I believe there is, how might I put this, there is a nobility, a real nobility in public service. And you referred to him as a public servant. I'm not arguing with your characterization, but did you mean to say that? And in what regard would you define him, given all that we know about him or think we know about him, as a true public servant?
Well, I think what I meant by that is a couple of things. And one is that it is important to distinguish him from electoral politicians, in part because being part of the federal bureaucracy, being part of the career civil service was really the key to his longevity and influence. Just so listeners are aware, Hoover became director of the FBI in 1924, and he stayed there to 1972. So he was there for 48 years, really at the center of federal power of the security state. So that was one point with that term, that we need to think about the kind of power he exercised as being, a little different from electoral politics. And then the other piece is that Hoover also did come out of a kind of tradition of government service. He was born in Washington, D.C., to a family that had worked for the federal government. And when he was appointed in the 20s, it really was as a kind of reformer who was championing all of these ideas about expertise and professionalism and career service in government. And so, it's not what we think of when we think of J. Edgar Hoover, but it's actually a pretty important part of his early legacy and then of the reputation that brought him to power.
Nope. I received the answer. Just wanted to interrogate that and give you a chance to respond for why you used that term. Now I get it. When we come forward with Dr. Beverly Gage talking about this new book, G-Man, J. Edgar Hoover and the Making of the American Century, there are all kinds of questions about how he amassed so much power over that 48-year period from 24 to 72 that you heard her mention a moment ago, what he did with that power over that 48-year period, why he was so popular over this particular period of time, and all the stories that we do know about Hoover and many more that we don't know about Hoover. A lot to cover, and we'll get to it in this hour when we come forward with Dr. Beverly Gage on KBLA Talk 1580.
We've got a lot to talk about.
Good thing we've got 3 hours.
More of Tavis Smiley when we come forward.
I know you want to leave me, but I refuse to let you roll.
Ain't Too Proud is a celebration that brings the audience to its feet.
Ain't too proud to beg, as you know it.
The Grammy-winning Tony-winning songs. The Tony-winning movies. Ain't Too Proud. The life and times of the Temptations. Returning to the Amundsen December 13th. Tickets at AmundsenTheater.org.
Will they find a home? Sponsored by Geico. Steve is intrigued by the paranormal.
Otherworldly spirits really make a house a home, you know?
Janice has different taste.
I'd like my house to not be haunted.
Compromise is tough, but these two won't have to compromise when they bundle home and car insurance with Geico. It's easy, and they could save even more. In the end, Steve and Janice found a renovated Victorian that's only haunted from 9 to 5.
Okay, wife's home. I gotta bounce.
Bye, Steve.
Bundling without compromise at geico.com.
It's pro time because at Lowe's, it's Provember. Save big with inventory you can count on, like Flex products or DeWalt power tools starting at just $99. Plus, Lowe's MVPs members earn up to 3 times bonus points per dollar on select items. Save all Provember long. Bonus points calculated before taxes and fees after applicable discounts, if any. MVP's Pro Rewards Program. Terms and restrictions apply. See Lowe's.com/L/Pro Loyalty Terms. Subject to change. Prices valid from 10/17/22 to 2/3/23 or until supplies last.
KBLA Talk 1580 is pleased to announce a can't-miss community event.
It's a celebration.
Welcome home, Mayor-elect Karen Bass.
You gotta be kidding me.
On Saturday, December 10th, 10 a.m. to 1 p.m., join KBLA Talk 1580 in Leimert Park at the intersection of Leimert and Vernon for this free public event as we celebrate Mayor-elect Bass's historic victory. There'll be live performances from Brian McKnight, Wapale, Club Nouveau, and more. There'll be food trucks and a diverse array of vendors, along with the attendance and participation from community leaders, elected officials, celebrities, business owners, and other notables. KBLA Talk 1580 will host Mayor-elect Bass on the main stage at 11 a.m. as we reflect on the importance of this moment and what it means for the Black community, women, and all Angelinos who believe in the limitless potential of our amazing city. We look forward to celebrating with Mayor-elect Karen Bass and you, Saturday, December 10th, 10 a.m. to 1 p.m. at the intersection of Leimert and Vernon.
It's a celebration.
This is a community call to action from KBLA Talk 1580.
We gon' celebrate your party with you. Come on now.
Interrogating your assumptions and expanding your inventory of ideas. Let's get back to Tavis Smiley on KBLA Talk 1580.
Talking with our guest in this hour, Dr. Beverly Gage, about her acclaimed new text, G-Man, J. Edgar Hoover, and the making of the American century. Dr. Gage, let me start with this right quick as I watch our time, and we're going to move through this hour and build on this foundation, which starts, to my mind, with the backstory for J. Edgar Hoover. Just tell me a bit about his backstory. Again, we know what we think we know, but you mentioned he was born in D.C. Many of us don't know that. Give me just a bit of his backstory, his family life, and we'll work our way up to 1924.
Sure. Yeah, so he is really a very pure creature of the city of Washington. He's born there in 1895. He's born to a family that he always described as being a kind of idyllic family and his idyllic childhood. When I looked into it, there are some pretty complicated pieces of his family past, murders and suicides. His father suffered from depression. So he actually had a pretty complicated family setting. But there were really 2 pieces of growing up in D.C. that seemed especially important to me. One was this tradition of kind of career government service that he's just saturated in from his first moment. And the second is that he's born into D.C. at just the moment when the city is really segregating in very formal and very rigid ways. And so he comes of age in this kind of segregationist, Southern, racist D.C. culture that becomes really very much part of how he thinks about the world.
What did his being born and raised during that time frame, how did that impact the way he saw the world? I mean, I know that it did. Is it fair to call him a white supremacist in his thinking? Tell me how you think he saw the issue of race.
Yeah, I think that is a fair characterization in lots of ways. He has a kind of deeply racist worldview. The most interesting organization that I came across that helped me to kind of think about this and explain it was his college fraternity, which was a fraternity called Kappa Alpha. It's still around today, but it was this fraternity founded in 1865 explicitly to carry on the cause of the white South, to honor the memory of Robert E. Lee, and by the time Hoover joined it in the early 20th century, some of its most famous kind of national members and figureheads were people like Thomas Dixon, who was the novelist who wrote the books on which Birth of a Nation, the famously racist film of 1915, sort of glorifying the Ku Klux Klan, that film was based on his books. And so Hoover is learning these ideas. He's coming to think about the world as a place of racial hierarchy. There are some interesting moments in his career, actually, when he acts a little bit counter to type on this front, and they're probably worth talking about. But I think it's certainly a fundamental part of the way he begins to think about the world even before he's in the government. Now,
we'll jump to those things, and we'll jump forward and come backward in just a second here. I want to hear a couple of those things that you suggested a moment ago that he sort of did a two-step on vis-a-vis the race issue. But let me just clarify this, and I think we're on the same page here. It is fair to say, though, that when he comes to power in 1924, which we'll get back to as head of the FBI, he already has a mindset of white power domination, yes?
I think that is fair, and he's particularly suspicious of black radicals, and this is true through his whole career. So he's suspicious of left-wing radicals in particular. He is especially suspicious of black people of many sorts who are involved in organizing and protest politics. But it's really when both of those traditions come together, right? Not only kind of his racism, but his suspicion of political radicals and revolutionaries. Those tend to be, the kind of most extreme moments in his career.
We'll circle back to that to be sure. But you suggested a moment ago there are a number of occasions where he did not play to type, as it were, on the race front. Give me one or two examples right quick.
Yeah, so real quickly, in the 40s, I found that the FBI actually engaged in some pretty extensive investigations into lynchings during that period. They didn't tend to result in especially spectacular prosecutions for a variety of reasons, Southern white juries, the Justice Department's own hesitations, but they did quite a lot of work during the 40s around that issue. And then, in the 60s, which we tend to think about in terms of the FBI's repression of Martin Luther King, of the Black Panthers, and rightly so, the FBI did have a whole series of operations against the Klan, and in fact, at the very moments that they're going after King, they are going after the Klan using many of the same techniques. And basically, Hoover didn't like groups that were either defying federal law enforcement power or using violence in ways that he thought undermined FBI legitimacy. And so, lynching, the Klan, they all kind of fit into that frame.
We'll unpack some of that a bit more as we move forward here. But again, just trying to follow you. I've read most everything you've written, starting with the book and all the op-eds and pieces written about the book, prepping for our conversation. And I saw a fascinating piece that you wrote. I saw it when it came out last week. That said, to understand the FBI, you have to understand J. Edgar Hoover. I'm coming to that question now because I want to frame this 48 years that he served as director of the FBI from 1924 to 1972, and it is your view that to understand the FBI today, we have to understand J. Edgar Hoover. For those who didn't get a chance to read that piece, can you sort of unpack what you were arguing there?
Yeah, well, that piece was first about something which has been really interesting to watch over the last 6 years, especially since Trump became a major figure, right? So Trump has obviously been at war with the FBI most of the time that he's been in national politics. And as a result, we've had this kind of partisan flip on the FBI, such that for the first time in about half a century at least, Democrats tend to like the FBI better than Republicans. And that has a lot to do, obviously, with Trump, with partisan politics. But one of the things that I wanted to do in that piece was then go back to the history and think about, how does this make sense? And so it's partly that essay was about the fact that for a lot of Hoover's career, a lot of liberals actually did like him, figures like Franklin Roosevelt, Lyndon Johnson, and then it looks at the ways in which both the culture and the structure that Hoover built up during his 48 years at the FBI, I think are still pretty fundamental to certain parts of the FBI's work today.
FDR, fond of Hoover on some level, as you mentioned. LBJ, fond of Hoover on some level, as you mentioned. The Kennedys, not so much, huh?
Yeah, the Kennedys, not so much. Those were years of some actually pretty interesting and often kind of entertaining struggles. I mean, Hoover didn't like the Kennedys, at least in part because they were kind of younger and more casual, more dynamic, and so he spends a lot of time, grumbling about things like why won't Bobby Kennedy wear his tie all the time? They're pretty funny memos.
Yep. How would you define his relationship or lack thereof with the Kennedys?
Well, it started out pretty friendly in lots of ways because he had been close to Joe Kennedy, the kind of patriarch of the Kennedy family. They were friendly and mutually supportive. And then he had actually worked with Robert Kennedy in particular a little bit when Robert Kennedy had been working on congressional committees, investigations into organized crime. So at first, Hoover would have preferred to have Nixon win in 1960 because they were very close. But he wasn't super upset about the Kennedys initially. But a few things start to happen. One is this kind of culture clash between the Kennedy style and Hoover's much older, more conservative style. Another is that the Kennedy administration really suggests that the FBI is not doing enough on organized crime, and Hoover is very angry about that. There are some interesting discoveries about John Kennedy's extramarital sexual life that Hoover kind of bats around as ways to keep himself in the loop during the Kennedy years. Interestingly, on civil rights stuff, they are not as far apart as our images of them would suggest. It's Robert Kennedy who approves the King wiretaps at first. John Kennedy is actually pretty hesitant about moving on civil rights until 1963, really. And Kennedy is very concerned about keeping the support of white Southern Democrats, who are this key part of the Democratic Party at that point, and who are one of Hoover's kind of favorite and most powerful constituencies.
Yeah. Again, the longer you talk, the more questions you give me, so I'm trying to keep up with you.
I can give you shorter answers.
No. I love it. I love it. That's why we have an hour. This ain't soundbite radio. We got time to unpack these things. That's why we do 3 hours every day. What do you make, right quick, of the irony that, again, given even today in 2022, when we frame J. Edgar Hoover and we frame the Kennedys, black people famously know this, that for years in black churches, you'd see on fans, the fans we would wave to keep cool in church, you'd see a picture of Jesus, Dr. King, and JFK or Bobby Kennedy on a fan at church. There was this relationship that black people had with the Kennedys. And so when you frame the Kennedys for black people and you frame J. Edgar Hoover for black people, you get obviously two very different reactions. And yet, I hear your point about where they were initially on civil rights. Bobby Kennedy thankfully evolved over time. But what do you make of the irony that they really weren't that far apart initially on civil rights?
Yeah, well, I think it was really key to the way the Democratic Party existed in that moment, right, where you had the solid white South in the Democratic Party, and so a lot of Democratic politicians, whatever their true views and desires might have been, were pretty hesitant about embracing civil rights. Certainly, it's true that both John Kennedy and Robert Kennedy evolved quite a lot over the course of their lives in a way that a figure like J. Edgar Hoover didn't. But it's also true that, well up to the end of the Kennedy presidency and even beyond, they were also working with Hoover to conduct surveillance. They, worked with Hoover to put pressure on King to separate himself from a couple of advisors and colleagues that the FBI was saying had ties to the Communist Party, and I think did have ties to the Communist Party as that goes. But they did definitely evolve in ways that Hoover never evolved. And actually, one of the things that was so interesting to me about his career was to see really the continuity of his ideas and policies from very early on, from the teens all the way up to the 1970s.
Yep. Speaking of the Kennedys and Hoover, one final question in that regard. You mentioned organized crime. Given the research that you did for this acclaimed new book, G-Man, J. Edgar Hoover and the Making of the American Century, what is the definitive answer, the definitive takeaway vis-a-vis Hoover's relationship with organized crime?
Yeah, Hoover is often accused, and I think to some degree rightly, of not having moved against organized crime early enough or comprehensively enough, particularly in the 1950s. So I didn't find much hard evidence of, there are all sorts of rumors and conspiracies and accusations that he was sort of in bed with organized crime or being blackmailed by the mafia, by the standards of evidence that I hold as a historian, I didn't see much evidence of all of that. But it is true that he was pretty hesitant about moving into organized crime because he was worried about whether he had jurisdiction for it. He was worried it would corrupt his agents. And then the FBI did start doing some of this in the late 50s, but they were doing it secretly and sometimes illegally, right? So planting bugs in the headquarters of the Chicago mob, for instance. And so they weren't going to go around talking about that stuff for a variety of reasons.
Yeah. I want to ask but one question about this for obvious reasons. But since you went there referencing Hoover's attitude, for lack of a better word, about the sexual predilections, shall we say, of one JFK, and we also know he was just as titillated by the sexual predilections of one Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. When we come forward after news, traffic, and sports, I want to come back to that because much has been written, much has been said about Hoover's, how might I put this, his sexuality, his own sexual peccadillos, and I want to learn what you discovered about that specifically. It is fascinating, always fascinating for me that he was so peeping Tomish, if you will, on the Kennedys. Peeping Tom, as I said, on Dr. King. He's got people wiretapped. He's listening to their activities. Again, trying to be, it's a family show here, listening to their activities, their sexual activities. And yet there are all kinds of questions about Hoover's sexuality. And I want to finally get a word on what you learned about that specifically. We'll ask a question about that and move on to other things that I find more fascinating in this new book called G-Man, J. Edgar Hoover and the Making of the American Century. The author of that text is Dr. Beverly Gage. More with her after news, traffic, and sports. You're listening to KBLA Talk 1580.
Courage is contagious. We're KBLA Talk 1580.
I'm Mike Moore, and here's the latest from the Black Information Network. The White House will host a roundtable focused on combating anti-Semitism this week. Second Gentleman Doug Emhoff, who is Jewish, will host Jewish leaders for talks Wednesday at the White House amid growing concerns about a rise in anti-Semitism. The event comes as former President Trump faces criticism for recently hosting a dinner with white nationalist Nick Fuentes and African-American rapper Kanye West. Ye, as he now goes by, made headlines last week following an anti-Semitic rant praising Nazis and Adolf Hitler. On this date, in 1955, the black community of Montgomery, Alabama launched their boycott of the city's bus system. Their actions came in response to the arrest of African-American Rosa Parks. She refused to give up her seat to a white man. And that's the latest. I'm Mike Moore from your 24/7 news source, the Black Information Network and BINnews.com.
crash in Long Beach is blocking the carpool and left lane on the 405 northbound before the 710. The 405 stopped up starting at Palo Verde Avenue. And we got a crash in Bell Gardens on the 710 southbound for Florence Avenue. It's on the right-hand shoulder, but it's a slow drive from Atlantic Boulevard. In Gardena, accident reported 110 southbound for El Segundo Boulevard. Looks like the left lane is still taken away there. The 110 is a slow drive from the 105. And they're looking for a crash in Santa Ana, blocking the carpool lane 55 southbound for MacArthur Boulevard. Watch for sudden slowing.
Dell's Days of Deals start now with savings on select XPS laptops and Alienware PCs powered by 12th Gen Intel Core processors, plus savings on accessories and free shipping. Call 877-ASK-DELL. That's 877-ASK-DELL.
This is the KBLA Sports Minute with Ray Richardson.
The following is a public service announcement for USC football coach Lincoln Riley and Chip Kelly at UCLA. Deion Sanders is in your neighborhood, and there's a good chance he'll be knocking on the front door of the top high school players in California. Deion is the new coach at Colorado after a fabulous run at Jackson State. Previous coaches at Colorado tried to recruit California talent. The difference is that the fathers and the uncles of today's top high school players saw Deion light up the NFL. Deion already has a commitment from Winston Watkins, a 4-star wide receiver from Fort Myers, Florida. Watkins was considering Texas A&M, but changed his mind when Deion was confirmed at Colorado. No debates, no speculation, just the info you need. That's your KBLA Sports Minute. I'm Ray Richardson. This sports report was brought to you by MVP Accident Attorneys. When it comes to your settlement, we're a slam dunk. Call 833-MVP-WINS or check their website at themvp.com for a free case review.
When you're the victim of a car accident, hiring the right law firm can be the difference between a rewarding settlement and striking out. Call the pros at MVP Accident Attorneys at 833-MVP-WINS for your free consultation.
Call on me, your MVP.
Health is Wealth and Medicare and Covered California's open enrollment for medical insurance is here. RHJ Insurance Agency can help you find affordable rates and the plan that's just right for you and your family. Call 562-204-6120 for your free quote. Don't leave your health to chance. Open enrollment is here and affordable coverage is just a phone call away. Call 562-204-6120 for your free quote and get the coverage you need. Go to www.rhjins.com.
Leaving things half done? Not a good option. Like a half-baked peach cobbler.
A gummy crust? I don't think so.
A half-done hairdo.
All done.
Shouldn't the curls be on both sides?
Or a half of a domino.
Bam! Big six!
But where's the other half?
Don't go halfway, especially with your immunity to COVID-19. Keep everyone safer this season by staying up to date with your vaccines and boosters. Visit myturn.ca.gov to find one near you. Brought to you by the California Department of Public Health.
This is KBLA Talk 1580. Talk radio. That's music to your ears. We're unapologetically progressive. KBLA Talk 1580.
Three-time WNBA champions, the Los Angeles Sparks, jump into their 27th season this summer with the most games ever in league history. Every seat in crypto is an incredible ticket into an experience of world-class professional basketball, jam-packed with in-game entertainment. Now is the time to get ahead of the holidays. Don't be the person grabbing a gas station gift card. Impress your fam and friends with an unforgettable experience. Secure your seats now at lasparks.com/tickets.
At Cedars-Sinai, we're honored to be named the #1 hospital in California and the #2 hospital in the nation in U.S. News & World Report's Best Hospitals Honor Roll. We're also proud to be named #1 in 6 specialties in Los Angeles. Thank you to our physicians, nurses, academic leaders, and thousands of other team members who bring their best to Cedars-Sinai every day. Learn more about our top-ranked care at cedars-sinai.org.
We knew you'd stick around. This is LA's home for progressive talk radio. Welcome back to KBLA Talk 1580.
Our guest in this hour, in case you've just tuned in, is Dr. Beverly Gage. She is author of the critically acclaimed new book, G-Man, J. Edgar Hoover, and the Making of the American Century. It is on everybody's, and I do mean everybody's, from the New York Times to the Washington Post to the LA Times to Publishers Weekly run the list, everybody is saying this is one of the best books of the year. And I am honored to have Dr. Beverly Gage in conversation about her new book, G-Man, J. Edgar Hoover, and the Making of the American Century. We've already learned a lot about J. Edgar Hoover in the first 30 minutes of this program, and now in the back half of this hour, a great deal more to learn, courtesy of her fine research for this text, which took her a decade to write. And finally, it's out. And we're pleased, again, to be in conversation with her. I was asking before News, Traffic, and Sports about Hoover being so titillated, so interested in the sex lives of the Kennedys, John and Robert, and the sex life of Dr. King, as we well know. What do we know about his own sexual peccadillos and predilections?
It's a funny combination of things that were very open and then things that were very hidden and secret and hard to get at as a historian. I think the most famous story for most people is the idea that Hoover liked to wear women's dresses, which, again, he might or might not have, but we don't have any real evidence that that's true in a way that makes sense or is persuasive to me. But what we do have in great number is evidence of his relationship with Clyde Tolson, who was the number 2 man at the FBI for most of Hoover's career and who was by far the most important relationship in Hoover's life. So they not only worked together, but they traveled together, they went to nightclubs together, they did basically everything that a social couple or spouses would do together. And in fact, one of the most, I think to me, intriguing pieces of evidence about what that relationship was were Hoover's photo albums. And there are lots of photographs in this book, but these were private photo albums, and a lot of them were very intimate pictures of him at the beach with Tolson, kind of hanging out in hotel rooms, that showed, a really intimate and in many ways quite loving relationship. Now, we don't really know what they were doing in the bedroom exactly, but they were clearly each other's, most important relationship, and they really functioned as a couple.
Yep. I know that I won't get into trouble with you using the word complex to describe J. Edgar Hoover, but when I say he was a complex man, unpack that for me as you see it through the Beverly Gage prism.
Well, on his sexuality, we can start there. So I said he's got this pretty open relationship, but of course he is militantly policing what the meaning of that relationship is. So if you suggested that he was a gay man, you might actually get an FBI agent showing up at your door saying, you must never say these things about our fine FBI director. And similarly, he policed and had purged from the government, hundreds, if not thousands, of gay federal employees in this period known as the Lavender Scare. So in his own kind of internal life, there's a lot of interesting stuff to unpack. I would say for me, the biggest kind of complicated political story of Hoover is that he puts together two things that we don't really necessarily think as going together. And one is this tradition of career, professional government service that he really was part of, especially in his early years, what we might think of as a liberal or progressive tradition. And then this kind of deep social conservatism on things like race, on things like religion, certainly on anti-communism, which is the big cause of his life. And so he puts these two things together in ways that I think is pretty uncommon. It's certainly uncommon today. And so I kind of try to explain his story as some tensions and overlaps between those two.
Speaking of race and the complexities of J. Edgar Hoover, we established earlier in this conversation that he came to power in 1924 when he started his 48-year reign, and some might say reign of terror, almost 50 years as director of the FBI. But clearly he had on his mind this notion of white and in his ethos this notion of white power domination, white supremacy. So no surprise here to black people, particularly that he would go after Fred Hampton, that is, in Chicago, powerful and popular Black Panther, say it easy, Tavis, Black Panther Party leader in Chicago. We all know about COINTELPRO going after the Black Panther Party writ large. We know, of course, about his spying on Dr. King and suggesting to King he ought to just kill himself. These stories are pretty well known in the black community, obviously, and beyond. But again, beyond what you said earlier about the ways he was already indoctrinated when it comes to race when he took over the FBI, what was it that just animated his going after black people?
Well, I think in some ways he was a pretty typical, representative of a kind of segregationist view that held sway in Washington. It held sway in a lot of the Congress for most of his lifetime, and in a lot of the country as well. And so I think what made him unique is that he was able to kind of build a bureaucracy and build a federal police system around many of those ideas. And that, of course, gave him tremendous influence and power. And that consisted of everything from the way he selected who an FBI agent could be. And from very early on, he was very, very specific about who he wanted that to be, right? It's still who we kind of imagine as an FBI agent, certainly during that era, the tall, conservative white guy in the suit. And he drew a lot of that generation out of his own university, which was George Washington University, and out of his fraternity, Kappa Alpha, which I described earlier as being this quite explicitly racist, segregationist fraternity. And, so at any rate, he refused to hire black agents most of his career, even when, as early as the 30s and 40s, he's under pressure from the NAACP. And then he, really came to view all forms of kind of black political participation, particularly protest and civil disobedience, really as just being a threat to what he saw as the way the world was supposed to work. And so, he conducted just incredible levels of surveillance and then harassment.
Yeah. Two questions here about the power that he amassed that you referenced a moment ago, as we established again earlier in this conversation. 48 years as director of the FBI, 1924 to 1972. Beyond the obvious, which is, the passage of time. The longer you stay in a particular position, the more power ultimately one amasses. Beyond that, tell me more about how he did, in fact, amass so much power.
Yeah, he's sort of a master of the bureaucratic arts. So our image of him as having files and having secret files on people, and that being a source of his power, is certainly real. It's there, and it's one of the tools that he has. But he has a lot of other tools as well. One is, building a whole institution that's kind of in his image and answerable to him. So just the way he hired his agents. He was also incredibly good at cultivating support at the White House and in Congress. One of my favorite chapters in the book is about how when Congress begins to have committees that need professional staff, which is really in the 40s, he ends up staffing all of these important committees with FBI agents or with former FBI agents. And so he's just got all of this kind of power and influence in that direction. And then the other piece that really fascinated me was how good he was at public relations and then at building a kind of popular constituency for the FBI. So he would turn to kind of conservative groups like the American Legion or the Daughters of the American Revolution, and they were kind of his his grassroots army who would come to his defense when he was under criticism.
To your point now and made earlier for that matter, he was very popular over that 48-year span from 24 to 72. And when we come forward, I want to ask you for examples of the ways in which you see, as the researcher of this fine text, G-Man, J. Edgar Hoover, in the Making of the American Century, the ways in which you see him strong-arming the nation, the country, into submission. What are all the things, not all the things, but some of the things, all these years later, that we are operating inside of, or frames that we still cannot escape, that have to do with the way that he strong-armed the country into submission as he wanted us to be. Again, it's a lot of power to amass and to wield over a 48-year period, and I think in some ways we're still feeling the impact, the effect of the Hoover era. Kind of hard not to. We'll get Dr. Gage's take on that when we come forward on KBLA Talk 1580.
Be sure to like and follow Tavis Smiley at The Real Tavis Smiley and get Twitter updates at Tavis Smiley. The conversation continues when we come forward.
Will Smith opens up about the infamous Oscar slap. Maisha Cairo here with your K-Black Minute News. As a guest on The Daily Show, Will Smith opened up to Trevor Noah about the incident with the Oscar host and comedian Chris Rock at this year's Oscars. Will Smith, who won his first Academy Award later that night, was promoting his forthcoming film, Emancipation, when he spoke with Noah about what life has been like since the shocking incident.
That was a horrific night, as you can imagine. There's many nuances and complexities to it, but at the end of the day, I lost it. And you just never know what somebody's going through. Not that justifies my behavior at all. We just got to be nice to each other, man. The thing that was most painful for me is I took my heart and made it hard for other people. I understood the idea where they say hurt people hurt people. Yeah.
I'm Maisha Cairo, and that's your K-Black Minute News.
If you have certain chronic conditions such as heart disease,
asthma,
diabetes, and you're 19 years of age or older,
52, 36,
42, you may be at increased risk for pneumococcal pneumonia. Ask your doctor or pharmacist about getting vaccinated with Prevnar 20, pneumococcal 20-valent conjugate vaccine, a Pfizer vaccine that can help protect against pneumococcal pneumonia in just one dose. Prevnar 20 is approved for adults to help prevent infections from 20 strains of the bacteria that cause pneumococcal pneumonia. Continued approval may depend on a supportive study. Don't get Prevnar 20 if you've had a severe allergic reaction to the vaccine or its ingredients. Adults with weakened immune systems may have a lower response to the vaccine. The most commonly reported side effect was pain at the injection site. For additional common side effects and full prescribing information, please call 1-855-213-2138 or visit Prevnar20.com.
I'm going to ask my doctor
about getting vaccinated
with Prevnar 20.
KBLA Talk 1580 invites you to join us in celebrating the season of giving by being part of the solution. As we enjoy great food, family, warmth, and well wishes in whatever our festive tradition may be, we share the beauty of the season by reaching out to the less fortunate. Please help us to help others with the KBLA Cover the Houseless Cozy Community Coat and Blanket Drive. All you have to do is drop off new or clean, gently used winter coats and blankets in the KBLA lobby during business hours. Now through December 20th, all of the coats and blankets will be donated to unsheltered individuals and families experiencing houselessness. Simply bring your donation to 4434 Crenshaw Boulevard in Los Angeles, near Vernon Avenue, from 9 a.m. to 5 p.m. weekdays. That's 4434 Crenshaw in historic Leimert Park. During the holidays and every day, let's remember, we keep us safe. We keep us warm. We are the safety net. And together, we can cover the unsheltered. Get caught up in the spirit of the season, the spirit of love. Make a difference with your friends at KBLA Talk 1580.
Less BS per broadcast. Fewer microaggressions per megawatt. KBLA Talk 1580.
Dr. Beverly Gage, are there examples you can give us of the ongoing impact of Hoover's popularity and his power?
Yeah, the popularity was really one of the most interesting things to me, because I think we have this idea of Hoover as this man that nobody liked. And when you look at most of his career, he actually has pretty widespread support. Probably the greatest symbol of that to me is a poll that was done in 1964, early 65, right after this moment when Hoover famously calls King, quote, the most notorious liar in America. It becomes a big public dispute. But if you look at the opinion polls after that had all played out, the question is, whose side are you on? One poll had 50% of people siding with Hoover, just 16% siding with King, and a whole bunch of the rest saying that they didn't know. And that's so different from how we tend, and rightly so, to think about who you ought to be supporting and who you ought to be condemning in that scenario. It just is one of those kind of historical moments that I think so important to think about and flip some things on its head. But in any case, what do we still see from Hoover? I mean, I think every movement of the 1960s would have been different without J. Edgar Hoover in office. Civil rights, Black Power, the New Left, the anti-war movement, they were so shaped by this kind of struggle with the FBI. And it's worth thinking about, what might have happened if someone else had been in that position. And then I think the structure of the FBI itself really comes out of Hoover's time. We have a lot more restrictions on the Bureau, and rightly so, than when Hoover was here, but some pretty fundamental elements are still there.
Yeah, there have been a long-standing debate in this country about his name on the building. What do you make of that?
Yeah, so the current FBI building, which is right there, kind of along the mall in D.C., just off the mall, is the J. Edgar Hoover building. It was built in the 1970s and named for him right after he died. Right now, the FBI is probably going to be building a new headquarters in either Maryland or Virginia, because it's not a great building. And the question is, should his name be there? I certainly don't think so. I think we can let, that era be what it was. But I would not advocate for having his name on the new Bureau headquarters.
In our final moments with Dr. Beverly Gage, a couple more questions I want to get out to her, including what she makes of the fact that over his 48 years of public service, as she mentioned at the top of this conversation, she also acknowledged that he didn't change his mind much. He didn't grow. Somebody said change is inevitable, but growth is optional. Change is inevitable, but growth is optional. Did Hoover just opt not to grow over that 48-year period? Not much change in who he was when he left versus when he came in, and that's disturbing in a lot of ways. And I want to finally close by asking whether or not, when reading this book, G-Man, J. Edgar Hoover and the Making of the American Century, whether or not we're going to be tempted to change our minds about what we think we know and like or dislike about J. Edgar Hoover. Dr. Gage's final comments when we come forward on KBLA Talk 1580.
A safe place to go loud. A great place for progressive politics. KBLA Talk 1580.
At Social Security, we are always thinking of ways to save you time and make things easier. That's why we created My Social Security. A My Social Security account allows you to access your earnings history and benefits information, request a replacement Social Security card, get a proof of income letter, estimate and apply for benefits, and more. Save time. Go online. Open a My Social Security account at ssa.gov/myaccount. Social Security. Securing today and tomorrow.
Produced at U.S. taxpayer expense.
KBLA Talk 1580. We've got a lot to talk about.
KBLA Talk 1580, reminding you when we fight, we win. Asian Americans Advancing Justice is the nation's largest legal and civil rights organization for Asian Americans, Native Hawaiians, and Pacific Islanders. Founded in 1983 as the Asian Pacific American Legal Center, Advancing Justice LA serves more than 15,000 individuals and organizations every year. Their mission is to advocate for civil rights, provide legal services and education education, and build coalitions to positively influence and impact Asian Americans, Native Hawaiians, and Pacific Islanders, and to create a more equitable and harmonious society. To volunteer, make a donation, or seek assistance, visit advancingjustice-la.org. That's advancingjustice-la.org. Or call 888-349-9695. 888-349-9695. This is a community call to action from KBLA Talk 1580.
Ew. Stuck in a cycle of rewashing your clothes? Ugh. Because you can't remove tough laundry odor? Ugh. When detergent by itself can't cut it, use new Downy Rinse and Refresh. With a breakthrough odor-removing formula, it removes odors in one wash, better than the leading value detergent in 3 washes, keeping all your laundry fresh. Now you can break the cycle of rewashing with Downy Rinse and Refresh.
Let's unpack a little bit more with Tavis Smiley. The conversation continues right now.
Got about 4 minutes left in conversation in this hour, which I've immensely enjoyed and learned a great deal from, as I'm sure you have, with our guest, Dr. Beverly Gage. The new critically acclaimed text is called G-Man, J. Edgar Hoover and the Making of the American Century. 2 questions here. One, how do you process, Dr. Gage, by your own admission that, as I said earlier, change is inevitable, growth is optional? Hoover didn't seem to grow a whole lot over that 48-year period.
Yeah, I think that's a great framework because he was actually pretty good at changing when he needed to, in the sense that the FBI would come under pressure. He would adapt to that. He'd take on a new set of duties, sometimes master them pretty well, and respond to circumstance. But he didn't change his ideas very much, right? What he's saying in 1917 looks an awful lot like what he's saying in 1972, and it's one of the reasons that he's so interesting to study.
Yep. Socrates once said, as I recall, that the unexamined life is not worth living. The unexamined life not worth living. What did you learn about him in that regard, that he wasn't given to much introspection?
It is true that he himself was not much given to introspection, but I hope that the biography does give us, nonetheless, a kind of more complicated story of who he was, and particularly of the impact he had on the rest of us. Because I think that having one-dimensional villains can be useful sometimes, but often it can blind us to the real history and to understanding how power really works.
Nope, I'm glad you said that, and I couldn't agree more. That's why I wanted to have this conversation. Never mind what we think we know about J. Edgar Hoover. I'm always open to, as I say all the time around here, having my my assumptions re-examined, and always open to having my inventory of ideas expanded about people and places and the world and issues. And so I didn't want to not have the conversation based on what I thought I knew of J. Edgar Hoover. So I think you're right. We know he's a one-dimensional tyrant, but what else is there that needs to be excavated? And you've done that quite well in this book, G-Man, J. Edgar Hoover and the Making of the American Century. My exit question is simply this. When we get a chance to read this book that everybody is choosing as one of the best books of the year, it will be award-winning on a variety of fronts, I am certain. Will the text, you think, change our minds ultimately about J. Edgar Hoover?
I hope so. It's not intended to be a revisionist book. I'm not seeking to redeem Hoover, but I am kind of seeking to make him more complicated, and in particular to remind everyone that he had lots of support, lots of popularity, and so the things that we want to condemn about J. Edgar Hoover, we might want to contend with as a country, not just make him a scapegoat, but think about what it all means for the rest of us.
I lied. One final quick exit question. Whether or not you think those persons in power today in our arena of law enforcement can stand to learn lessons from the book about Hoover.
Oh, I think so. Absolutely. I mean, one lesson is don't leave one guy in power for 48 years. Yeah. But I don't think we're in much danger of doing that again. But yeah, I think the book is full of cautionary tales about what it means to be kind of too fond of your own power, to not question your own assumptions, and some of the real damage that can come as a result.
It's a powerful polemic, and everybody's talking about it, and I'm honored to have had the hour to talk to Dr. Beverly Gage about her critically acclaimed new book, G-Man, J. Edgar Hoover and the Making of the American Century. Congratulations on all the good that I know is to come and all the honors and awards you'll receive for a book that everybody's talking about, and good to talk to you about it, Dr. Gage. Thanks for your time. Happy holidays.
Thanks so much.
Good to have you on. Serious mental decline is not an inevitable part of aging. You can boost your short and long-term brain health and significantly lower the risk of dementia. We will tell you how when we come forward after news, traffic, and sports on KBLA Talk 1580.
KBLA 1580 Santa Monica.
I'm Mike Moore, and here's the latest from the Black Information Network. In Texas, the man suspected of murdering African